Why hello there, and welcome back to another Let's Make Us a Character Special Edition. And part 2 of my 2-part look into the magic system of Fatal. Such as it is. Last time I looked at the pretentious yet incredibly shallow lore and weird fundamentals of magic use in the game, including the fact that you may find yourself needing a sacrificial princess and a lesbian egg every time you want to cast a spell. And this time I'm going to get into the spells themselves, as well as the magic using occupations, all 4 of which I'm sure are completely playable, as is all of the content in Fatal. So I guess let's resume our unfortunate dive into the magic of Fatal. Part 2. F for effort. And we will begin this particular severed leg of the journey by opening up Chapter 12, Spells. And I guess let's just pull up one chaos magic and one ceremonial magic spell, and these two were next to each other in the book and also are some of the first spells, so I guess they're good enough. So first, let's look at Acidic Touch, which is a level 1 chaos magic spell, costs 8 magic points to cast, because all level 1 spells cost 8 magic points to cast, is of the Earth discipline because mana is found in Ether, but apparently also all of the other elements as well, including Ether. Has a range of touch, an area of 1 creature or object, and as chaos magic, a random chance of having a random chant, ingredient, and ritual as explained in the previous video. And has the effect of the fingertips of the caster secrete magical acid for the duration of the spell, which cause 1d10 life points of damage per round of contact with flesh. And, of course, the target creature must be touched successfully. If the target creature resists being touched, then the caster must make a brawling skill check, which, as I believe I mentioned in one of the previous videos, is a phrase that appears in the description of around 200 spells. And if you are smarter than Byron Hall or have ever actually played or read a role-playing game, you probably realize that if you need to explain a basic concept hundreds of times, it might be a good idea to explain it once as a defined concept and then just reference that concept, like, I don't know, some kind of melee touch attack. Listen, I'm not saying that Dungeons & Dragons was good, just that it set a pretty low bar for other designers. So that is how the spell is supposed to work, but now, how it doesn't. First, because I'm sure you're wondering, no, the brawling skill does not actually cover its specific use in spellcasting, nor are there any general rules for touch attacks. Like, there is no current armor against touching. There just aren't rules for touching someone without the intent to inflict physical damage. And the brawling skill itself specifically only covers making randomly rolled unarmed attacks. Although I guess that would technically let us know if we were contacting flesh. Second, as stated, Acidic Touch causes acid secretion for the duration of the spell, and deals 1d10 damage per round of contact with flesh, with a duration of instantaneous. Yes, even within a single spell, an isolated piece of content that you can see all of at once on screen, he somehow failed to provide a duration for a spell that is clearly intended to have a duration. Literally all he would have had to do is look slightly up or down to see that the listed duration was wrong. And in case you're wondering how he was able to make such a huge oversight, I weirdly enough have an answer for that, because in my bizarre quest to find the pre-2003, let's just call it 0th edition of the game, I was able to download the original spells and spell lists in Microsoft Word format from a June 2001 archived version of the Fatal Tripod page. Unfortunately, none of the other files had been archived. And this spell used to have a completely different effect, which was changed, but the spell's duration was not changed to be consistent with the new effect. And keep in mind, this was like 2 major revisions ago, and this is literally the 3rd spell in the book. And third, even if the spell did have an actual duration, 1d10 life points of damage per round of contact with flesh makes it sound like the goal here is to grab onto the target and maintain contact with flesh, which is actually kind of an interesting way to apply a spell, which is of course immediately negated by the fact that Fatal doesn't really have grappling rules. Like, there is the wrestling skill that seems to start from the assumption the characters are already grappling, but much like the brawling skill, leaves the actual outcome of the attack up to a random roll, because, I don't know, I guess giving players any level of control over their character's actions would just ruin the realism and/or historical/mythological accuracy. So that was a chaos magic spell, and obviously a ceremonial magic spell is basically the same, but let's look at one anyway. Against every wild animal, aquatic creature, and robbers, which is a level 2 ceremonial magic spell as indicated by the italicized title, and costs 16 points to cast, as do all level 2 spells. Is in the discipline of water, has a range of self, an area of 10-foot radius, and duration of the remainder of the present hour, because of course the natural forces of elements and mana adhere to an arbitrary base 12 division of the day. Why wouldn't they? So, just to be clear here, if you cast this spell at 11 o'clock, it lasts for 1 hour. If you cast it at 11:59, it lasts for 1 minute. And if you don't know the exact minute of the hour, well, you really don't have a very good e-dial then, do you? But also, you can roll a d60 -1, more or less. And I hear you there. In the last part, I did say that Byron Hall couldn't figure out how to roll a d2000, but now he's telling you to roll a d60, and, well, there's a few possibilities here. One, he approached the problem of how to generate a number 1 through 60 abstractly without considering that it was a d60. 2, he learned somewhere, either through another game or through someone telling him how to roll a d60, and did not understand that the concept was transferable. And 3, which is the most interesting one, maybe he didn't even write this. Yeah, I never really bothered pointing it out before because this whole book is just credited to Byron Hall and that is part of the mythos, but at the end of the book he does offhandedly give vague credit for much of the content to his abettors, including hundreds of spells. Of course, he also credits multiple people with proofreading, which there doesn't seem to have been any of, so maybe he just made all of these people up so that people would think he had friends. But moving on, the spell is also referenced from the Greek magical papyri, because of course it is. Yeah, I said it would get stupider, didn't I? In the grand tradition of Fatal, spells listed of ceremonial magic are not fabricated by the author of this game, but have been obtained from real-world references cited at the end of this book. A particularly ridiculous example of this nonsensical and uniquely academic idea that it is always preferable to not have original ideas, which of course had the presumably unforeseen effect of all of the ceremonial spells being restricted to ones that he could find in some collection of documented folk magics, meaning that he includes spells that are completely useless in-game, like ones for alleviating aching feet, which has no actual mechanics, because that's what historic folk magics are generally like. But also, even with all the lackluster options, ceremonial magic still accounts for only 83 of the game's 480-ish spells. But as is apparently the #1 rule of Fatal, any content, no matter how bad, useless, or detrimental to the game, cannot be removed once added, and basically just has to be written around. Anyway, the spell requires a chant that, as funny as it would be, I am not going to try to pronounce, requires a tassel, and the ritual of tying the tassel to your garment and speaking the chant, and prevents wild animals, aquatic creatures, and robbers from moving within 10 feet of the caster for the duration. Of course, because this game has to be so damn literal to its sources, that presumably means that only robbers and wild animals are affected, and anyone else who wishes you harm, or domestic animals for that matter, are not. So that is basically how spells almost work, and I am not cherry picking here. I picked these two spells specifically because they were the first chaos magic and ceremonial spells that were next to each other in the book, and meant I only had to take one screenshot. They both just coincidentally happened to be awful. If I were going to cherry pick here, I would be pointing out spells like Bestow Ulcer, which gives the target an ulcer with no specified mechanical effect. Convert to Cannibal, which makes the target have cannibalistic urges, but does not force them to act on those urges. Discursivity, which forces the target to change the topic of conversation every 1d100 words. Ejaculate Acid, Blood, and Poison, which makes the target do those things. Swollen Testicles, which causes the target's testicles to swell with, once again, no specified mechanical effect. Force Fart, which makes the target fart for several seconds. Living Monstrosity, which causes an unborn fetus to become diseased or deformed. And of course, who could forget the infamous Fatal Spell, which ends all life on the current world, a really cool, edgy, original idea that he didn't just take from Ultima. And as always, saving the best for last, well, best within the context of Fatal is awful, have her cadaver, a spell which causes one female humanoid cadaver to appear to be alive and unconscious. Yes, specifically for that reason. Now, mind you, there are actual normal useful spells too, but also lots of useless normal spells, like one for detecting the presence of each of the 4 temperaments, which, remember, have no effect on anything. And overall, just like every other piece of content in this game, the vast majority of those spells exist for one of 2 reasons. Either just to take up space in the book to have the biggest number of spells, or just for edgy shock value. And I have talked about the shock value aspect before, but feel the need to reiterate that nobody who would be shocked by the content in Fatal would ever even be looking at Fatal. It is edgily shocking content for edgy little shits to look at and imagine how shocked someone would be by it. Which is why I specifically chose examples that show off how many of the spells serve absolutely no purpose beyond inflicting cruelty. It is just another one of those things that really gives you insight into the mind behind Fatal and the vision of the game that he was either too incompetent or just up his own ass to actually produce. As I said in the sex video, it is a world upon which the characters are to be inflicted, a sadistic power fantasy where everyone and everything exists solely to be used and abused mercilessly by the characters. But also, as I said, not for any kind of actual self-gratification, but rather as part of some pathetic fantasy of people who neither know nor care that you exist being offended by your doing so. And returning to the spells, You may have noticed that despite useless information like a chant ingredients and rituals stating see Chapter 11 magic being included in around 400 spells, at no point is any kind of casting time mentioned. Well, if you want that information, we have to go back to Chapter 10, Combat, and look at the Duration of Action table, the only place in the entire book where this information is provided, despite the fact that most spells have a casting time that is so long that you cannot actually use them in combat. And I don't know about you, but to me, nothing quite says difficult, detailed, and realistic more than having magic point cost and casting time of every single spell based on the spell's level. Like, literally thousands of random ingredients and magical effects, but couldn't be bothered to actually consider individual casting times and point cost for spells. Which also has interesting effects like Aching Feet as a level 2 spell requiring you to recite the chant 9 times in 1 round, which is 3 seconds. But on that topic, if a round is 3 seconds and a level 1 spell takes 1 second to cast, does that then mean that you can cast 3 level 1 spells per round? And no way to tell. Like, I could look at the rules and try to make some guess about how spellcasting and combat rules maybe work together in some abstract way, but that would be a waste of time because just like the interaction of any 2 rules in this entire game, the idea of taking a character casting a spell and placing them into initiative with characters in melee combat was likely never even considered. Every single action that a character can take exists in some kind of vacuum without even the vaguest attempt to even pretend that this is a cohesive set of functional rules. But on that hypothetical topic of casting spells in combat, you may have also noticed that just like casting time, spells don't mention anything about actions or checks or anything like that. And with the reputation that Fatal has for being overly complex, you might reasonably assume that spellcasting would have some kind of rules, perhaps using those useless sub-abilities like Enunciation and Kinetic Charisma. But with all of the work that I have done to dispel those rumors of Fatal being in any way complex, you hopefully instead assume that there are not. And for the most part, that is the case. With the notable exception of the combat spellcasting skill, which is used to maintain your concentration while casting spells in combat, regardless of the spellcaster's distance from the combat. And I feel a bit like a broken record here, but once again, clearly a situation where he imagined one scenario, a magic user not more than a stone's throw away from the heart of combat casting spells into the melee, and said, yes, that is using magic in combat. No other scenarios could possibly exist. I am very, very smart. Or maybe he just assumed that the combat rules already covered that, or that they would when he finished them, which of course he had no intention of doing. Regardless, point is, it is a drive check with the spell failing on a result of 17 or lower, possibly wasting the ingredients, and possibly triggering a random magical effect. And if this check to maintain concentration while casting spells in combat sounds familiar, yeah, that's because it's basically just a concentration check from D&D 3rd edition. The main difference being that in 3rd edition, they actually have specific conditions and associated DCs instead of just any distance from the nebulous concept of combat. Also in 3rd edition, it is actually mentioned in other parts of the rules that concentration checks are a thing that needs to be made, versus Fatal, where the combat casting skill is never mentioned in the combat or magic sections, and the fact that you need to make a check to cast a spell in combat is only ever mentioned in the skill itself. And I guess as long as I am on the topic of barely or not at all mentioned skills, There is also spellcasting familiarity, which lets you identify a spell that is being cast, and spellcasting specific, which, dead fucking serious here, increases the effects of the specific spell by 1% per point invested, and is very notable in Fatal's overly restrictive skill system for being available to all spellcasters for all spells that they know, which does unfortunately also mean that it is not listed or referenced anywhere in the book outside itself. So like so many other things, it is something that you will only know about if you happen to stumble upon it. But now, probably the part that you've been waiting for, because it is one of like the 5 things that people actually mention about this game. Appendix 3, Random Magical Effects. And just to summarize, a random magical effect is triggered by getting a 17 exactly on a combat spellcasting check, being interrupted or otherwise mispronouncing a chant, which there are not rules for, or substituting similar ingredients, like sacrificing a prince instead of a princess. So, a thing that is somewhat difficult to do unintentionally, especially if you don't know that the combat casting skill exists. And of course, random magical effects are randomly rolled on another 40-page D2000 table. And I'm sure you're just dying to hear what kind of things are on this table, and I will say, this is where he really got a chance to flex his creative muscles, with such entries as 2 gay ogres appear within 3d10 feet and begin butt-plugging as if tomorrow will not exist. 666 demons appear within 666 miles and impregnate 666 females in 666 minutes. A disembodied winged manhood of 3d10 feet appears within 3d10 feet, and it is horny. Which, I stand by my assertion, is the only intentionally funny thing in this entire book. A gerbil escapes from the target's rump. All who see this are stunned for 1 round. Which my younger viewers may be a little surprised to learn is actually a pop culture reference to an urban legend about Richard Gere. Or more likely, considering the time, a reference to a reference. And human male appears, drops his trousers, removes his scrotum, and offers some. So, even by the standards of Fatal, pathetically try-hard and, even more notably, poorly written and awkwardly phrased, largely due to this uniquely Fatal style of trying to be very, very adult, but with very childish language, because presumably it is not academically appropriate to say ass or fuck, but also actual technical language is beyond the capabilities of the author. And those were literally just the first 5. If I wanted to really start digging in, we have things like all characters within 3d10 feet are now holding shovels, become zoophiliacs, now believe that bathing in urine is healthy, now sexually desire their relatives, not others, see their nipples fall off, or transmorgify into fire and die. And then, of course, things like the manhood of the nearest male becomes a proboscis and feeds him by sucking out organs, and all females within 3d10 feet must now perform fellatio on the caster. And of course, the all-time classic, all males within 3d10 feet now believe that rape is wrong. Which I'm sure Byron and, well, probably just Byron thought was hilarious. And then, of course, just like dozens of unfinished entries for making targets worship random gods that I guess weren't interesting or funny enough to actually come up with, and 428 entries for just randomly casting other spells, including Fatal. So every time you roll on this table, you have a 0.05% chance of not having to play Fatal anymore. And once again, I am cherry-picking ones that are humorously bad without going too far into uncomfortable territory. But in the interest of fairness, for some reason, I will now just roll 10 random effects. The nearest master treats their apprentices like they actually value them for 3d10 days. All characters within 3d10 feet acquire a bonus of 1d10 with the ambidexterity skill. All characters within 3d10 feet are now holding daggers. The caster hallucinates that a pterodactyl just flew over the party and shat on their foot. All characters within 3d10 feet acquire sexual sadism. The caster permanently swaps all weapon skill modifiers with the target. The spell is cast, seal item. All characters within 3d10 feet now worship the kobold god of. All characters within 3d10 feet acquire a penalty of 1d10 with the sight skill. All characters within 3d10 feet are now holding whips. So only one that was really in any way salacious, with the rest just being unremarkable at best and an annoying thing you have to deal with at worst. And a lot of the things on this list, like the nearest master treats their apprentices like they actually value them for 3d10 days, don't even affect anyone involved in the situation. It is just a thing that happens somewhere because a perpetual 12-year-old in the early 2000s thought it was funny, presumably because of some inside joke. And that more or less covers the functions of magic, such as they are. Which means that now it is time to look at the occupations that have the unfortunate distinction of being able to use those rules, which means revisiting Chapter 7, Occupations. As you may recall, or not, I mean it was a very long time ago at this point, the options for magic-using occupations are Druid, Hierophant, Mage, and Sorcerer, with mages using ceremonial magic and sorcerers using chaos magic, while Druids and Hierophants also use chaos magic. Yeah, those stupid referenced spells are exclusively used by a single occupation. And as you are likely piecing together, Fatal, the most original and revolutionary while also historically set mythologically accurate role-playing game ever created, did just kind of lift the wizard-sorcerer dichotomy from Dungeons & Dragons, which, considering that Fatal was conceived in late 2000, the year that 3rd edition was released, makes it incredibly obvious that Byron, with almost no knowledge of fantasy in general and even less of role-playing games specifically, somehow picked up a player's handbook and said, well, this is just math, I can make one of these, and like so many first-time game designers before and since, set to work copying and improving the current edition of D&D under the assumption that both the mechanics and concepts within were just general standards and not distinctive elements that could easily be traced to a specific edition of a specific game. Like, even things that have been changed, like replacing spell slots with magic points, still carry signs of their origins, like spell slots literally just being translated to specific magic point costs. And if you look at the 0th edition, you can even see that the original race options even used to include halflings and half-orcs. But for now at least, enough about the little-known fact that Fatal is essentially a D&D hack, and let's jump into this and take a look at the Druid. Or rather, priests, because he never really finished separating them into two distinct occupations. And of course, the most notable thing here is the insistence that actual information on priests can be found in the campaign setting, but of course is not, because that is even more incomplete than the core book. And as priests, Druids and Hierophants do share some characteristics, such as their spellcasting being affected by their piety points. But in classic Fatal style, not only do you get a percentage modifier to all aspects of the spell, but also the penalties are significantly more severe than bonuses, with no penalty requiring a piety score of at least 71. Which, remember, is rolled on a D100 with modifiers for things like being old, ugly, or in poor health, because this game has just a little bit of YouTube atheist vibes. So, keep in mind that somewhere around 70% of those already incredibly low odds of rolling a Druid or Hierophant are characters who would also have all of the effects of their spells reduced by 25 to 100%. Yeah, you could actually roll Druid like a good Druid with impossibly high ability scores, and then end up with a minus 100% penalty to all your spells. Also, I have to wonder how intentional the language of all spells cast by priests are affected according to their PP is, because it is juvenile enough to match Fatal's overall level of maturity, but also Byron Hall is definitely oblivious enough to have written that without realizing it. And priests also share a likeliness of advancing in spell level table because, in addition to meeting the ability requirements, casters also need to roll to advance in each spell level. And that is basically it for priests, but now on to druids specifically, who actually have some interesting features. For example, stating that druids must study for 20 years, and then actually taking that into account and specifying that all druids must start at level 1 and increase their starting age by 10 years. As well as stating that if a character wants to multi-class into druid, they must study for 20 years to do so, which is just an astounding level of consistency for Fatal. Like, he said a narrative thing and then took into account how that would affect a character and specified rules for it. This might be the only time that happens in this entire 980-page monstrosity. But then, just to get nonsensical again, it is specified that there are 3 classes of druid: bards, prophets, and priests, with bards being bards, prophets being female sorcerers — gee, if only there were some widely used word for that — and only priests being actual druids. So apparently this occupation includes 2 sub-occupations that are not actually this occupation, which I could be sly about and be like, I wonder what that means. But this is obviously just left over from a point when you could just make a character like you would in a normal game instead of having to roll through some kind of duck vagina of stupidity. But onto the actual rules, druids must choose 2 of the 5 magical disciplines, avoiding the opposite disciplines, which are those opposite them on the pentagram. So basically you are restricted to 2 adjacent disciplines, and get 1d4 randomly determined spells per level. And considering that druids are actually specified to start at level 1, and that the vast majority of spells are completely useless, means that you could start with 1 spell, and that spell could be Detect Melancholic Temperament or Force Fart. And even then, that spell might also require ingredients that range from inconvenient to nearly impossible to obtain, and you would be statistically likely to be taking a penalty to the effects. And that is actually where the random magical effects come into play. As mentioned, modifying the chant or using substitute ingredients adds a random effect to the spell, but that random effect is repeatable. Basically, you create a new version of the spell with that new effect that can be cast again with the new modified components. So if you end up with no usable spells, you basically have nothing to lose from modifying your spells until you get something vaguely useful or die trying. Or inflict horrible permanent afflictions on the rest of the party, who are not allowed to get upset about it because the #1 rule of Edgy Little Shit Club is you are not allowed to get offended no matter what someone does to you. Oh, unless it's a girl who doesn't have sex with you, in which case you are allowed to get offended, but that is the only thing you're allowed to be offended about. Druids also have the incredibly unlikely to be used ability to amplify their magic by casting their spells in druid circles of at least 2, which of course is just a bunch of dumb math without any real point to it, once again including a square root but not requiring you to solve for y, and I'm honestly not even going to bother wasting my time going through because even by the standards of Fatal, it is a pointless waste of time and space. Although we do get one of those very rare, almost gets it moments here with, even though a druidic circle of effect is powerful, druids are sufficiently rare that it is difficult to find a number of druids, let alone a number who can cast the same spell. And yeah, I would call those odds rare, or better, negligible. So negligible that anyone with even a vague understanding of the odds would not have wasted time writing those rules. But moving on, druids actually do get a fairly hefty amount of skills, including complex ritual, which is apparently required to cast spells of 6th level or higher, despite having no actual rules, and that never being mentioned anywhere else in the book. Also, druids are the only occupation that has access to this skill. Druids also get 18 plus 1d12 magic points per level, and regain 1 point per level per hour. But, unlike wizards, hierophants do not recover MP more quickly while asleep. Yeah, not even priest, it literally says hierophant in the druid entry, which is going to be even funnier later. And druids gain advancement points for successfully using their occupation skills, damaging enemies in combat, and casting spells, which is shockingly normal for Fatal. Like, druids might be the only occupation in the entire game that actually gets experience points for all of the things you would normally get experience points for. And I already covered them in the previous video, but might as well go through the restrictions again, which are Intelligence and Wisdom 115, in addition to Language 105 and Wisdom 110 to cast first level spells, which then go up by 5 points per spell level, as do the per spell level requirements for all occupations, so I'm just going to mention it this one time. Are male only, human only, tend to be of balanced temperament. Few druids are originally peasants, most are serfs or nobles, which is really weird because based on all that math I did, which I'm sure Byron Hall also knew how to do, around 57% of druids are peasants. And then religion, and who cares, it's just Byron's little interpretation of what druids are. So let's just move on to Hierophant, which as stated shares the same opening text with druids because they were originally both part of a single entry, and are specified as a priest of a specific god that is not a druid. A variety of gods are available in Nevaria. Specific information for hierophants of each god are detailed therein, which, as stated, are not and never would have been. And that's it. That's the entire description for hierophants. So, on to the rules. While not all hierophants cast magic, yeah, that's a weird thing to just throw out there with no further explanation. Those who do gain 26 plus 1d12 magic points per level. Remember, druids only got 18 plus 1d12. And recover at a rate of 1 per level per hour, and actually are hierophants this time. Require Language 90 and Wisdom 100 to cast first level spells, and that's it. And you might notice that a few things are slightly missing here, like skills, rules for gaining advancement points, all the requirements and other pointless entries that even the most useless occupations have spaces for with nothing in them, and, oh yeah, rules for how many spells you know and how they are selected. And the easy supposition to make here is that all of that information is supposed to be included in the campaign setting, for each individual god, which, as I keep saying, even under the best conditions, never would have gotten done. But also is just weird in general because, as unfinished as the Hierophant is, the fact that the Druid says Hierophant instead of Druid at one point suggests that the Druid entry was edited from the Hierophant entry, but then for some reason, half of the information from the Hierophant entry was cut. And since there is nothing else to cover here, I guess I will just move on to Mage, which is yet another non-European term, but at least this time one that he admits to knowing isn't European, and using despite the fact that its use here contradicts a premise of Fatal. And I think that might be one of the most telling pieces of text in this entire book. As I keep saying, Fatal isn't a game. It's an academic argument, an exercise in a high school debate club. He throws out his little premises and then attempts to support them with evidence. Evidence from random sources he probably didn't actually read. Evidence he just made up. It doesn't matter if anything is true or even coherent, as long as it's formatted correctly. But even then, he is so lazy and self-absorbed that he will just violate those premises whenever it is the easier option or he has a contradictory idea. Like just saying that, hypothetically, adding a footnote like this would probably seem easier, at least to someone who wasn't very familiar with word processing software, if they happened to, use the term mage, assuming that it was of European origin, and then later learn or be called out on the fact that it wasn't. Incidentally, this footnote does not appear in the adult lechery version. And like Druid and Hierophant, starts with some shared text for mages and sorcerers, known collectively as wizards. Which of course doesn't really say much of value other than that mages and sorcerers also have to roll to advance their spell level on a different shared likelihood of advancing spell level table with quicker advancement, and do not have any kind of PP bonus or penalty. But onto mages specifically, as mentioned, they can only cast ceremonial magic, but are otherwise unrestricted in terms of disciplines, although they can choose to specialize in one to get a 10% bonus to advancing in spell level, at the cost of not being able to learn spells from disciplines that oppose their specialty, which is probably a bad decision, because as you may recall, there are only 83 ceremonial spells, most of which are completely useless. And to cut it down to just first level, only 20 of the 121 first level spells are ceremonial magic. And those spells are mostly things like alleviating coughs or discharge of the eyes, giving an erection, making a sleeping woman say the name of the man she loves, or inflicting a woman with a scent of the uterus. And then of course there are fewer and fewer ceremonial spells as levels increases, to the point that some levels have none. Because, as mentioned, ceremonial magic was given the absurd restriction of having to be referenced from a historical source, and actual historical magic didn't have spells to throw fireballs, call lightning bolts, or turn people into lizards. It was invoked to cure ailments, bolster business, inflict petty revenge, or make someone fall in love with you. Literally 2 of those 20 first level ceremonial magic spells are love spells. And overall, there's a dozen different love spells of different levels, which are not incrementally more powerful or anything, but literally just different love spells that he copied from his little sources. So, not that it matters, but mages start knowing a number of spells equal to 1/10 their intelligence score. Or rather, level 1 mages do, as it is specified that mages starting above level 1 instead get 1d10 spells per level. So if you start at level 1 with 110 intelligence, you get 11 spells. But if you start at level 2, you could start with as few as 2. And those spells are, of course, randomly determined. Although it also doesn't actually specify how you select spells as a first level mage, only how many you know. Although it does actually specify how you gain new spells after you started playing. Future spells are acquired by learning. A spell cannot be learned if it is never encountered. Which is done by, what else? Rolling on another table. and presumably is what that random number and selection of spells for higher level starting mages is meant to simulate your prior experience of finding and learning spells throughout your maging career, which is of course completely random and arbitrary because I guess nobody ever told Byron that statistics apply to groups, not individuals. So, just like a wizard in Dungeons & Dragons, because as I already said, this is very obviously copied from that, a mage can hypothetically learn every spell on their list, if given the opportunity to do so. Because unfortunately, being able to learn any spell, as long as you can find them in the game world, puts you entirely at the mercy of the Aedile to learn new spells, which, if they are running the game in the intended style of an antisocial child, will not work out well for you. I mean, you can't just find a spell because you want to learn it. In fact, you should have your spellbook stolen by trolls for having the audacity to even ask. But moving on, mages have access to the bookbinding, research, spellcasting familiarity, and symbology skills, and like druids and the complex ritual skill, are the only occupation that get spellcasting familiarity. They also get 38 plus 1d20 magic points per level, too bad they don't really have anything to use them on, and regain 2 points per level per hour, or 3 while sleeping, and gain advancement points for casting spells while in dangerous life-threatening conditions or as a means to an important purpose, which is going to be really hard when almost none of your spells are useful in really any situation, but hypothetically would gain you advancement points equal to thrice the MP spent. And jumping back to requirements, require Language 110, Math 105, Analytic 100, Drive 105, and Reflection 100 to cast first level spells, which, reminder, are almost entirely useless. But onto the other requirements. Female mages are rare. Mages can be of any race but Ogre, Borby Tingarna, and Hill Troll, and as mentioned, few Anakim study magic because they do not qualify to be mages based on social class. Most mages are ethical, though neutral regarding morality, tend to be melancholic, are apparently exclusively nobility despite the fact that you can roll mage on the noble or serf table, and are equally likely to worship a god or ignore the gods for their studies. Wow, that was so useful. I'm so glad that bit of text was there. However, mages are also notable for being one of the very few occupations that actually use the training rules, meaning that to advance a level in mage, you must spend 4 weeks training with a mage of a higher level. And that might not seem immediately terrible to you, like yeah, 4 weeks is a long time, but also you aren't thinking in a fatal mindset. The Aedile can't just put a higher level mage in every time you need to level up. One should only exist in the game if they have decided to put one there independently based on logic and history and how much of their incel rage they need to take out on the players that particular day. You know, totally normal, reasonable Game Master stuff. And there's not really anything else worth getting into here, so let's move on to the final spellcasting occupation, Sorcerer, who, as stated, share the opening 2 paragraphs and spell advancement table with mages before going off in their own interesting direction, which is amusing enough for me to actually read to you.
Magic was either first discovered by accident or introduced by a god. In either case, the first to dabble with magic did so by trial and error, and have been known as sorcerers ever since. Discovering that they have a natural and innate ability to use magic, sorcerers believe that they are gifted above all others. Those around them who do not have this gift, however, usually shun the sorcerer, and in some cultures kill or banish them, calling them warlocks or witches depending on the gender of the sorcerer or sorceress. Generally, sorcerers do not cast in public because they are likely to be hunted by assassins, bounty hunters, and possibly armies. sorcery is a crime beyond high justice, and usually subject to cruel treatment such as mutilation. When valued by others, sorcerers are sometimes called prophets. Some female prophets assist druids. An ancient name for a sorcerer is pharmaceutis. Having no need for grimoires or rigid training, most sorcerers withdraw from society to practice and develop their magic through self-exploration. It is common for sorcerers to gather in groups known as covens. Sorcerers are dabblers and for this reason cast only chaos magic. Most sorcerers practice black magic.
So yeah, can you guess which of the magic-using occupations is probably Edgy Boy's favorite? Yeah, probably the innately powerful sorcerers who have to practice in seclusion because they are feared and hated by a society that's jealous of their superior innate abilities at magic and playing dissonant shred guitar. But let's see how he treated them mechanically. Sorcerers must roll a d4 to determine a number of disciplines, and then roll a d100 to determine which disciplines they can use. Once again demonstrating the mindset of this game because, in his mind, tables use d100s even if they can use a d10. And then once that's sorted, sorcerers get 1d6 spells per level, which they do actually get to select. Like, they are the only magic-using profession that is specified to be able to select their own spells, which basically makes them the only magic-using occupation that is more or less guaranteed to start with at least one vaguely useful spell. Sorcerers also have access to the Divination, Combat Spellcasting, Cosmos, General Planes, and Constellation skills. So yes, each of the spellcasting skills, including 2 necessary ones, are only available to one of the spellcasting occupations. So if you rolled up a mage or sorcerer, you would likely have no idea that you even needed to make a complex ritual check to cast a spell of 6th level or higher, and if you rolled up a druid or mage, likely wouldn't know that you need to make a combat spellcasting check to cast spells anywhere near the vague nebulous concept of combat. And remember, you are only allowed to put your 1d10 skill points per level into your occupation skills. So the only points that could be spent on non-occupation skills are the ones you get for your birthday, which is hilarious that of all things, Fatal gives your character skill points for their birthday. So only sorcerers can effectively cast spells in combat, only mages can effectively identify spells being cast, and only druids can effectively cast spells of 6th level or higher, because there is no actual thought or intention put into any of the decisions made in this game. But moving on, like mages, sorcerers gain 38 plus 1d20 magic points per level, and regain them at twice or thrice level per hour. And also like mages, gain advancement points equal to 3 times the magic points spent to cast spells in dangerous situations or for an important purpose. But unlike mages, actually have access to spells that can meet those criteria. Then requirements: Drive 110, Intuition 100, and Reflection 105 to cast first level spells. Can be of any gender, and like most of the occupations, any race other than Ogre, Borby, Tingarna, and Hill Troll. Then, because they are very edgy, are unethical and tend towards immorality. Tend to be of sanguine temperament. God, just imagine the sort of pretentious asshole you would have to be to think that this was something important enough to add to a game, despite attaching no mechanics to it. Are peasants or serfs, which is actually consistent with the tables, and tend to worship gods concerned with self-indulgence and shameless acts, because they are, as I keep pointing out, incredibly edgy. So, unsurprisingly, having the least amount of bullshit and being the only one Byron seems to actually be interested in, Sorcerers are also the most playable of the Fatal magic users. And when I say most playable, I mean the only one that is actually even vaguely playable. Like, Druids, with their 1d4 random spells per level and 18 plus 1d12 magic points, are almost guaranteed to be useless. Hierophants are literally unplayable because it's never stated how many spells they get, how those spells are selected, or even how they gain advancement points. And mages just don't have useful spells, out of some weird, misguided attempt to add historically accurate magic to the game. So, back to those odds from the first video of rolling a playable magic user, we can basically cut out everything other than Sorcerer. And even after 2 videos, I still haven't even touched on magic items and don't really plan to. Because I will tell you this right now, there's just nothing worth mentioning there. Like everything else in this game, it's just more. More multi-page D1000 tables, more edgy bullshit added in some asinine attempt to offend some PC boogeyman, but stripped of any actual impact by the sheer monotony of it all. Just more of what you get in every other section of this book. More shitty edgy jokes, more stupid, pointless, unfair content that seems to exist solely for the purpose of punishing players for even daring to try to play the game, and of course, just enough normal useful content to make it clear that this whole thing is not just an elaborate prank. So that is basically it for the magic rules in Fatal. And like everything else in Fatal, it is a wholly unremarkable system weighted down with a remarkable amount of garbage. Like, the most noteworthy part of the magic system is just how clearly it shows that Fatal is, at its core, just another early 2000s low-effort copy of D&D 3rd Edition, which tries to differentiate and prove itself not by being unique, innovative, or, functional, but just by having the most things and the most offensive things. Although I do feel the need to point out that he did fall quite a bit short of the over 500 spells promised on the back of the book. That's right, I caught Fatal exaggerating its contents. It may have taken 6 videos, but I think I can confidently say that I have finally destroyed the credibility of Fatal. And fortunately for me, I don't really have anything else to say on this particular topic. Like, there's not really anything to be gleaned from the magic system that hasn't already been stated, other than perhaps that this game is even more haphazardly thrown together than even I had believed. Like, I am no longer surprised by how bad this game is, just how consistently bad. But that is it for now from the world of Fatal, until the next time that I feel the need to farm some clicks. But until that time, you should check out some of my videos on good games. I do actually make videos on good games too, and you might enjoy those. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy my sassy wit, art, and saucy euphemisms, you can follow me on Blue Sky and Tumblr, or catch me streaming on Twitch occasionally, just, not very often. Also, there is a Discord now because people kept asking me if there was a Discord, and now there is. Links to all of that in the description. And as always, an extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails. Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Diablade, Nikolai Snowtail, Huggo, Randy Mulholland, Remogus, Renee D, Stephen Hafner, Stephen Kramer, The Hateful Flesh, Tila Glar, Toshirokuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or channel memberships. two different things that provide similar but distinct benefits because they are on different platforms that only offer different benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, smash the buttons, whatever they are. Or, maybe click on one of these other videos that has mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.